Misha here, and trying to look at some naval vessels. And last time we looked at the 6 main fleet carriers of the Kaibutei, the 6 that attacked Pearl Harbor, and we kind of left them off at the end of 1941 when Japan was riding high. We had Akagi, Kaga, Shoryu, Hiryu, Shokago, and Zuikaku. In this video, we're going to look at 4 more and different types of carriers. We've got 2 early carriers that by World War II standards would be considered escort or light carriers, but in the beginning were just carriers. We had Hosho, the original carrier, and really first of its type in the world. And then we had Ryujo, which was actually meant to be the first of at least 2 or 3, but in the end, didn't quite happen that way. Then we have Junyo, which is an interesting story, frankly, of the Hai or Haiyo class. And finally, we have Taiho, arguably the most advanced Japanese carrier to actually see true service, Shenando notwithstanding. So we've got 2 still quite large fleet carriers and 2 smaller light carriers we'll talk about. And we'll talk about events leading up to Midway and the fates of at least some of the vessels from the previous video. As always, if you could, like, share, subscribe. And if you'd like to see more historical and naval videos, watching, sharing the video, feedback, the more interaction I see, just more inspiration to kind of get on that horse again. So let me know. With that, let's go back to right after World War I and the plans for Japan's first carrier and one of the first carriers ever to be laid down in the entire world. Our model of Hosho here from Eaglemoss, it's still the 1/1100 scale as before, die-cast. It's actually from 1944. And while she didn't change a whole lot in her looks in the preceding 20 years, there were some we'll get to. But no, she goes all the way back to 1918. That's when she was originally planned for and budgeted for. And in the beginning, Hosho, which actually means Phoenix, was planned as a seaplane tender. Now, the first planned aircraft carrier to really be laid down would be a year earlier in Britain, HMS Hermes. And so she was under construction while this was still just in the drawing stage. But actually, Hosho would beat her into commissioning and actual service. They saw what was going on in Britain post-World War I. By 1919, they re-engineered the plans from seaplane tender to true aircraft carrier. And from that point, Hosho is laid down. The construction begins in earnest before the end of 1920. And she's launched from her slip in November of 1921, and she's commissioned into IJN service in December of 1922. So right at 2 years from beginning. And while Hermes got a head start because of things going on in the UK, it was not actually commissioned until 1924, so it beats it pretty good. In 1923, Hosho here would basically go into testing and trials. They began practicing takeoff and landing. They evaluated the design. And then in 24, it would go back to the dockyards for refit, rework. For one thing, they removed the island, something that will persist for a few more years in Japanese service. They also removed the crane and a few other things like that. So by 1925, she's going back into use and working on Hosho and what they learned here really helped with Akagi and Kaga in their whole process. And by 1928, she's in active service, working alongside Akagi and then later Kaga. And we'll see her aircraft updated quite frequently. But what do we have here? Overall tonnage kind of just dry, about 7,500, and then loaded up around 9,500. So yeah, pretty small. Under 170 meters long, so about 550 feet long. And she's just a little under 60 feet wide on her actual body, and then the flight deck goes out to over 70 feet. Speaking of, the flight deck was about 550 feet long itself, so pretty much the whole ship. It had 2 hangar bays, one in front, reserved for smaller fighter craft, and one in the rear, reserved for torpedo bombers. This is long before dive bombers. She has 4 kind of multi-purpose 5.5-inch guns, and then 2 3-inch guns that are meant for anti-aircraft use, although these might have been installed after the fact. Originally, she was planned to have a top speed of up to 30 knots, but because of what the Japanese were kind of seeing with other navies and use in early carriers, they intentionally slowed her down to 25 knots, which was actually the same as Hermes. Her flight group ranged from about 12 to 15 early on, and they had some really early naval fighters. Like there was a Mitsubishi 1MF fighter. They had the earliest like B-1M torpedo bombers. But already by 1928, she gets the first update to her fighters with the A-1N, and then by 1931, she gets the A-2N and the B-2N bomber. Still biplanes, still pretty primitive, but you can already see the progress. Typically, she would have 9 fighters and 3, although she could carry up to 6 bombers too. That's really about it. Her crew is a little over 500, depending on exactly the configuration. And she was mostly used for training, testing, kind of getting doctrine down, but she did see service before and during World War II. For example, by February of 1932, she's operating alongside Kaga in Chinese waters. She will engage, along with planes from Kaga, enemy aircraft. She will also provide support to Japanese troops on the ground and hitting installations. And for a couple of months, Hosho and Kaga's air wings work together. Obviously, she's a much smaller aircraft carrier, but it's still support, and at this day and time, there's not a lot of opposition in the air. After that, she would go back for a minor refit and just refreshment. And then the next major event would come in 1935 with the 4th Fleet incident, where she would get caught in a typhoon along with other elements of the Japanese Navy. She would be damaged, so she'd have to go back into port at the end of that year, and she would be in dock 1936 getting repaired and updated. They would do what they could to strengthen her. They would reinforce the flight deck. They would give her updated anti-aircraft, yada yada. By 1937, she is again supporting operations in the China theater. And then in 1938, she's turned over to the reserve, and in 1939 designated as a training carrier. That said, she is actually present and providing a support role in 1941 with Pearl Harbor, but she didn't work with the main carrier group. Rather, she provided submarine detection, cap patrols, scout missions for the main Japanese battleship element of the Navy. And after she did her task, she helped escort the carriers back home to friendly waters. And from there, she would continue on. In fact, she would serve at the Battle of Midway. Well, again, kind of on the second line, second string team, but we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. Japan's first carrier, and technically the first to be commissioned in the world. Just for comparison, Hermes was about 600 feet long, had a crew of about 580, and had a flight group of roughly 20. I should also mention that after updating their fighters a couple of times by 1940, they kind of determined that the A5M Claude was the most advanced fighter, which at least it's a monoplane, that could operate from Hosho. And the B4Y Jean was the most advanced torpedo bomber. I don't believe that dive bombers could ever operate from her, but I could be wrong on that. So she's kind of fixed at that. And at this point, her air group is around 10 or 11 airplanes in total. And again, in 1940, these aren't just super duper outdated, especially if she's in a support scout role. But obviously, as the war would go on, these would become less and less useful. But interestingly, she would soldier on a lot longer than you would think. I should also mention that early on, her funnels, her stacks, could be moved, rotated. They would actually fix these in a horizontal position during the refit in the 1930s, and they'd kind of stay there for quite some time. And her aircraft, or I should say anti-aircraft armament, would be improved a little bit here and there, but this is a problem that Japan kind of has with all their naval vessels, and so she's not exactly a huge priority. But a lot of pilots trained on her, and again, she saw combat. But she's quite small, and just at the beginning. She was actually expected to have one sister ship, the Mishaco, but she was actually canceled before even they started making her in 1922 or 1923, and eventually we get the much larger Mishaco in the main fleet. But with that, when Japan entered the war, they had 10 carriers. We've talked about 6. This is number 7. Let's talk about number 8. Ryujo. And this model here is really as she was commissioned in 1933. And when she was planned and construction began in 1929, the Japanese thought they were being very clever. They found a loophole in the original Washington Naval Treaty that basically said if it was under 10,000 tons, it didn't really count as an aircraft carrier. So that was the idea. They wanted to have her about 8,000 tons dry, so it'd be about 10,000 loaded up. And they thought they could get themselves a bonus carrier out of this. Unfortunately for them, the London Treaty would come the following year and plug this loophole, so it didn't really work for their benefit. But they're already making it, so nevertheless, they go ahead and launch it in 1931 and commission it into the fleet in early 1933. Originally, it was to have a flight group of 24, so about roughly double, give or take, that of Hosho. But in 1931, the Navy said, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, we needed to hold 48 fighters. Getting it close to Akaga, or getting it close to Kaga and Akagi. At least, half as much. They tried. Basically, they just stacked hangars on top of each other. It wasn't a great idea because it made the ship very top-heavy. Overall length, 180 meters, 590 feet long. A little bit wider, 60 some odd feet, 70 feet across. Had a crew of about 600, give or take its exact configuration. It did have A little bit better air defense as it would launch. Some 5.5 millimeter dual purpose guns, some 1-inch guns, and actually some more rapid firing, smaller caliber guns would appear later on. She was faster too, at about 29 knots. By this point, they discovered that, limiting to 25 really served no purpose. And she, of course, was outfitted with the advanced fighters of the day, and you'll see her changing out her fighters and torpedo bombers several times throughout the 1930s. In this configuration here, she's got old school biplanes on her. And one of her first major assignments, which was given in 1934, was to test out this new dive bomber thing. Hey, is there anything good going on there? So Ryujo here would be one of the first Japanese vessels to take on board early dive bombers, D1s, and try them out. And that's kind of where she was at when the Typhoon hit the 4th Fleet incident in 1935. And she was already top heavy because of the stacking hangars and more weight than she was meant to carry. So she was damaged. She had to go into port. She would end up with a refit in 1936. By this point, they've already realized we can't have 48 aircraft on board. So going forward, you'll see her with anywhere from 24 to 36 planes, typically. And after the refit, she will be sent over to Chinese waters to support operations there in 1937. And then in 1938, she gets what was at the time the spanking new A5M Claude airplane. And she'll continue to get updates of the various bombers. She'll eventually get the B5N Kate torpedo bomber. And she was able to operate the A6M0, unlike Hosho. And they did what they could to make her useful. She would kind of go in and out of being considering a training carrier, but at various times she was even the flagship of the 2nd and the 3rd Fleets throughout the late 30s into the early 40s. When the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, she was around, but holding the line, second line, kind of doing duties closer to home waters, and really didn't have much to say, except she would be used to support the invasion and occupation of the Philippines, although she wasn't seemed to be all that effective. Her flight group was, so she'd be sent home, going for a little refit. And then in 1942, she would be actually used to attack Singapore and would do actually quite a bit of raiding rather successfully throughout February, March, April of that year. Then she would go back for a resupply, and when it would come time for the Battle of Midway, she would be again kind of on the northern flank, second string, and she would be part of the group that was assigned to launch strikes against the Aleutian Islands. Now, she looked similar to this, but not exactly. For one thing, by this point she's got modern monoplanes, including the Zeros, like I said, the B5Ns. They did what they could to give her a little better balance, a little bit better air defense, but she's definitely not just a ship made under the restrictions of the treaties, but one made intentionally small and kind of asymmetrical to try to get around them. As I said a minute ago, they thought to make more than one of these if it worked, but since it didn't, Ryujo here would be the only member of her class, because what's the point? But they had her, and she had a record that will continue for a little bit anyway. And it's a neat model, and I think it's neat that it's as she first launched in 1933 here. What do you think? Kind of goes very well with our 1932 cargo we looked at in the first video. The Junyo of the Haya or Hiyo class, and this is kind of in between. It's definitely more fleet carrier size than it is pocket carrier, escort carrier, light carrier. But it has a very unique history. And there's a little bit of kind of back and forth and subterfuge. And it's funny because by this point, when this was first dreamt up in 1938, Japan had long since renounced the London Naval Treaty and all that. But the idea was these two ships, Hio and Junyo, were actually ordered, commissioned to be built by the Japanese mail steamship company as fast passenger freight, cargo mail liners. But it was a bit of a backdoor deal. The Japanese government, the Japanese Navy, actually paid for more than half of their construction costs, with the understanding that when war were to happen, they would probably seize them and turn them into carriers or auxiliary ships of some type. To that end, from the very beginning of their construction, they were built basically to be aircraft carriers, but on paper they would have, passenger compartments and whatnot. In reality, they had double hulls, they had various fuel tankages, they had spots for elevators, they had extra high ceilings between decks for hangars and just aircraft stuff. And they were even sped up. Originally, they wanted to be about 24 knot craft. Well, the Navy insisted they'd be capable of at least 25.5 knots, so their power plants were increased, so on and so forth. And they weren't even really close to being completed when in 1941, long before even Pearl Harbor, even before the original group was being assembled in February, the Navy basically took the option to purchase both incomplete hulls from the company and would outfit them as originally auxiliary carriers was the name. And interestingly, whereas Hio would technically launch first, Junyo would actually be commissioned in May of 1942, just a couple months before her sister ship, and actually the namesake of the class. So what do we have here? She's roughly a 25,000 ton vessel and just under 720 feet long, so about 220 meters. Pretty good girth on her. Like I said, she's had a top speed of over 25 knots, and the air group was roughly 54 when fully loaded. 2 elevators. She actually did have a folding crane on board. She had an island, and the funnel, the stack, was actually integrated into the island. I believe it was one of the first, or if not the first, Japanese carrier to do that. Yeah, basically a little bit slower, didn't have quite the capacity, a little bit lighter than like Akagi and Kaga, but still more going on than like Soryu or Hiryu. And it was a carrier. They originally were assigned with 18 D3A valves and 18 B5N Kates and 12 A5M Clods, but even before the Clods could really go operational, they were already replaced by A6M Zeros. And of course they had a couple of spares of each aircraft on board to get that total of 54. And of course she had anti-aircraft, mostly 40mm and 25mm guns. Some were dedicated anti-aircraft, some were the dual-purpose guns that worked oh so well for Japan throughout the war. I'm being very facetious. And a crew of roughly 1,200. It would fluctuate by 20-30 people up and down either way, but it gives you the idea. Pretty good sized crew. Definitely much larger than Ryujo and Hosho. But like I said, Junyo here would actually launch first, and they would get her very quickly into service, and she would operate alongside Ryujo and be assigned to basically attack targets on the Aleutian Islands, the Alaska campaign up north, And after that, her sister would join her, and kind of as the Japanese Navy is wont to do, they would operate together more often than not, complementing each other. I should also just mention that because of it being introduced later, because it was introduced later, the Taiho was considered a just carrier, not auxiliary, not secondary, what have you, whereas this one was still kind of in that line because it wasn't a purpose-built 100%. But then the Battle of Midway happened, and, well, needs changed. For example, she would see more Zeros on board and less bombers as the war would go on, and would have a very interesting career. Besides, even if the ship itself is interesting, it's not, it's not really special, if that makes sense. It's just tried and true technology. When we looked at the fleet carriers, each time we looked at one, it was pushing the envelope faster, better armor, more advanced flight deck maybe. This one, it's a chunky, solid enough carrier. But there's always that little bit of nod to how it started off as, at least in theory, a passenger liner. On the other hand, its history is pretty cool and unique for what it was. And the idea was basically they wanted to surprise any enemies by being able to quickly convert multiple quote-unquote civilian ships into warships. So even though the London Treaty wasn't a concern now, they wanted to kind of still underplay their strength and then turn around. Of course, the reality was very, very different. But it was one of the last major full-size carriers that the IJN would put to sea. But with that, let's talk about really the last of note today. The IJN's Taiho, which was planned to be the first of a whole new line of 21 carriers. It was supposed to be the first of 6 to its design, which was essentially an upgraded Shokoku. And then they would be supported by 15 of the Unri design, which was an updated Hiryu. So a little smaller, a little faster. And this was to be the new fleet to take advantage. And this actually goes all the way back to the 4th naval expansion in 1939 when it was approved and ordered. And she was laid down and construction began in the summer of 1941. So just a couple of months really before things got serious in September with training for the attack on Pearl Harbor, as it would be. But construction would take quite a bit of time. In fact, she was not launched until halfway through 1943 and was not formally commissioned until March of 1944. And then after roughly a month of training in home waters, the admiral at the time would transfer his flag to Taiho here on April 19th, 1944, because she was the best, biggest, most well-equipped, sturdiest, strongest, smartest carrier, not just left in the fleet at the time, but potentially that Japan had ever made and maybe ever will have made. So she's going to have a long career, right? And she's built for it. She's a biggin. Taiho comes in at about 30,000 tons unloaded, light, dry. But this quickly balloons to 35,000, even 37,000 tons when fully laden down with fuel, bombs, aircraft, personnel, supplies, etc., etc. So pretty much like others. Overall length is about 260 meters, so over 850 feet. And of that, a lot of it's flight deck. Over 840 feet are flight deck, and it's just under 100 feet wide, so as wide as the widest carriers. In fact, square footage wise, square meter wise, it is the largest flight deck at the time in the Japanese Navy. It's not just a matter of size. As I'm sure you know, it was Japan's first armored flight deck. And we don't just mean like a little bit of tinfoil. It's 3 inches of hardened steel armor plating with a latex coating over it for, well, lots of purposes. Anti-slip, anti-corrosion, there's better protection. Yeah, so it's even got a thin layer of protection over that for environmental things. And while the upper hangar isn't really armored, the lower hangar is. And to be fair, the fuel tanks didn't have the best armor. The storage areas for bombs and ordnance were armored. It also had internal protection against torpedoes, and it had an armored belt around the waterline. So this has a lot to do with the weight, but it's also just a large carrier. She had a crew of over 1,750, so it's one of the largest we've looked at, really just about the largest crews. Now, the air group is interesting. It fluctuates from a high of 90, it planned of 96 plus spares, down to a low of like 53 plus spares. And then it kind of settles in at around 63, 64, 65 plus spares. So pretty much commensurate with the Akagi and Kaga. But here's the difference. This is built, including its elevators, to take the newest aircraft. Sure, the A6M0, but also the new upcoming A7M. I've done a video a long time ago on the channel looking at the A7M. You can check it out. Maybe one day I'll have a chance to revisit it. Sure, it could take the B5, the Kate, but it also would have newer aircraft and newer bombers like the D6 and the reconnaissance variant, and it also would have the D4 and it has the latest, largest, beefiest. Mostly, from what I'm recalling, it's dive bombers, multi-purpose bombers, and then the A6 and hopefully the A7, although, that will eventually get curtailed. But that goes to show you they were trying to future-proof it. It also had a number of the 100mm guns on board. I believe it was 6 twin mounts of those. And then it had up to 51 of the smaller, essentially 1-inch guns, and they were in triple mounts. So basically you had 17 triple mounts with a 13mm going off there. And this really to show them kind of learning a lesson with anti-aircraft, although too little too late's a thing. Also, while it wasn't in the original plans in 1941, by the time Taiho here would take to the seas, it did have a couple of radars on board, so by the time it was commissioned, it did have radar. Of course, many other Japanese vessels did by 1944 as well. But I hope I'm kind of just conveying that they were trying here. Oh, and it's not too, despite its bulk and everything and weight and size, it wasn't too slow. It was over 33 knots top speed, so a little bit slower than previous carriers, but still faster than Kaga and Akagi. Certainly faster than Junyo we looked at there. And this is really where they're pinning their hopes. Like I said, this was the first, and then they were going to do 5 more based on this, but with a few more design improvements. Because again, the design is pre-war, even if it was built during the war. They've learned some things, especially with modern technology. And then 15 slightly smaller but faster carriers to support them. That was the plan. You know what they say about plans, though. But she looks really good. I mean, it's one of my favorite Japanese carriers in the Eaglemoss line. A lot of stuff going on here. Very neat look. It has that heritage going all the way back to Soryu. But it's really pushing it forward. And armored flight decks and armored carriers are a thing that both the U.S. and Britain have gone back and forth on, to do or not to do, all or nothing scheme. Well, this is Japan's answer. So I'm sure it'll pay off great because they're designing it to take multiple 500-kilogram bomb hits on the flight deck, multiple torpedoes to the belt, and to keep not just afloat, but keep fighting. So certainly nothing like the Titanic would be happening here, right? But yeah, she would be the flagship of the fleet coming into the summer of 1944. And they really needed her because by this point, Midway's 2 years in the past. And the situation is far different for the Japanese Navy at this time than it was in December of 1941. So with that, let's close out the video by talking about the fates of the original ships and a few others besides, kind of getting us up to the midpoint of the war in the Pacific. How about that? With that, let's move from our new friends and go back to our old favorites, the 6 main fleet carriers. You know, when Japan entered the war, they had arguably the largest and the most modern, and frankly, most advanced when it came to tactics, aircraft carrier fleet in the world. Britain had 8 carriers, but only one was actually operating in the Indian Ocean, South Pacific, which was HMS Hermes. The rest were in the Atlantic or elsewhere. The U.S. had 7, and 3 were operating in the Pacific. But obviously Pearl Harbor did a number. Still, they were putting up a good fight. So what was going on as we roll into 1942? And they're still kind of operating these in 3 basic groups. Soryu and Hiryu working together. Shokoku and Zuikoku working together. And Kaga and Akagi. And again, they'll team up and do things, but it's kind of easier to do that. And let's first catch up with the oldest and most venerable Kaga and Akagi. And just as a refresher from video 1, my Akagi is from KB, which used the Eaglemoss tooling, just kind of put it on a nicer stand. And the Kaga here is actually from when it first deployed in 1932, so it has what I can think of as the kind of cake topping multi-tier deck system. But by this point it looks almost identical to Akagi here. I think of them as stepsisters. Anywho, they're kind of sent south and towards Australia, and they will actually strike in February of 1942 and have very good success. They will sink 8 Allied ships, damage over a dozen more. The only kind of downside, Kaga will scrape a reef and do some, not critical, but some damage, which slows her down, kind of limits her effectiveness a bit. On the other hand, Akagi is doing really well. They're having very, very light losses in February. So moving forward, after striking at Australia nearby, very effective, they're going to go for the invasion of Java in March. Akagi will go straight for it. Kaga will actually end up, after a little bit of work there, going to port to kind of repair her damage. And from that point into April, Akagi will move on, going towards Colombo and striking there. And it's actually at this point where she will continue to engage. And at this point, there are some American naval ships they're fighting, but it's a lot of British forces, including HMS Hermes. In fact, in April, fighters from Akagi will be responsible for sinking Hermes and some other vessels besides. So that's another victory. Now, it's not all going their way, but for these ships, it's pretty good. Finally, by May, though, Kaga's getting fixed up. She's almost ready to go. And Akagi, after nearly 5 months of just constant operations going to and fro, she needs to put in for a minor refit, resupply, a little bit of R&R and shore training for her crews. So that's what she does. Finally, between May 25 and May 27, depending on what ship, they muster up to go to a little island, an unknown speck in the Pacific, no one's ever heard of, Midway. And this is, they're gonna draw out the U.S. carriers, and they're gonna do away with them finally. Because if there was any wrinkle in the attack on Pearl Harbor, any part of the plan that could be said to have been a failure, it was not damaging or sinking the 3 U.S. carriers. It was a stroke of very good luck for the U.S. and very bad luck for the Japanese that they were out that day. If they had been there, well, not worth thinking about. But they weren't. But the whole thing about Midway, the Japanese have superiority. And they are going to get the U.S. into a stand-up fight and use their superiority, especially what they feel, to just have their way. And if the carriers are gone, their thought is they can continue to roll over the Pacific and get the U.S. in a position where they can get a favorable peace and get what they want. But it's Midway. Still, these two are on their way there. So what about our Dragon twins here? Smaller, lighter, faster, more modern compared to these. At the beginning of 42, they were basically assigned to go over to the Dutch East Indies and assist operations like Borneo and all that in January and early February. They actually detach some of their air group to go to the land, and operate from land to better support ground forces since there's really nothing going on in the air. And they collect them back, and then they meet up with Kaga and Akagi by late February to attack Darwin, Australia. Pretty successful raid there. And then moving into March, they help with Java. And then they prep for the Indian Ocean raids. And they help with Colombo, going through all that. And then they're ordered back home in mid-April. But then after the famous Doolittle raid, which I did do a video on quite a long time ago now, probably should revisit that, Suryu, Hiryu, and Akagi are ordered to break off heading for home and search for the U.S. carriers that should be in the area. Again, Kaga's getting repaired. But they come up zeros and end up heading back home and put in for a refit, resupply. And since their air groups are still, I wouldn't say green, they've had quite a big experience, but they could do some more training. So they're sent to land for a few weeks to practice bombing and just gunnery and such while the ships are getting refit. And that's what happens in mid-May. And then these 4 fleet carriers are rounded up and given orders to head to Midway. But what about our last 2 over here? Aren't they going to the party? At the beginning of 1942, they pretty much do the same thing as the other carriers, working alongside them in different levels, going towards Australia and all that. But in March, instead of heading towards Java and doing that area, they're actually pulled back closer to home waters to defend Japan and close interests in case the Allies want to launch a counterstrike. Keep in mind, there's still the 3 U.S. carriers out there, and they don't know what's going on. They also end up taking on some new A6M0s. They had some, but they actually beefed up their fighter group a bit, cycled things around, got a few new pilots. Anyway, they're back in action with the rest of the fleet by April. I should mention that while Akagi kind of has the honors of Hermes, that Soryu and Hiryu did try. They actually sunk a couple of British cruisers, but their plans were too late for the party at Hermes, so just pointed that out. But anyway, they were there for Colombo and all that in April. But then their paths diverge again. May 6, Battle of the Coral Sea. And we'll talk a lot more about it in the third video in the series. But this is basically where the U.S. carriers Lexington and Yorktown face Shokoku and Zuhiku. Not to mention some light carriers, again, for the third video we'll talk about. And it's a much more pitched battle. They all launch bombers and all get hits in. The U.S. would have losses. Eventually, Lexington would have to be scuttled. Yorktown would have to put in for emergency repairs. Now, Zukuku got lucky. She kind of got in some weather or rain squall. And this was a good and bad. It kept her from directly engaging in the battle, but it also meant that she didn't directly engage in the battle. So she got away scot-free, although she did lose aircraft, if the ship was fine. But Shokoku took some major damage in this, and thanks to damage control, she wasn't lost, but it was a bit of a touch-and-go thing, and she too lost quite a few planes. So she had to limp back, and both lost combined over 90 aircraft. So their air group was depleted, especially their fighters. That's not good. So one damaged ship and not a lot of protection. And then on their way back, they hit another pretty substantial storm, and Shokoku is nearly lost again. She's already damaged, she's already foundering. She almost goes under, but again, damage control. They do get her back. But she's going to be in dry dock for some pretty extensive repairs until August. And Zukuku, her problem is, in addition to her sister ship just not being available, her air group is depleted. She's going to get new planes, new pilots, and then it's going to take time to train them. So they're just not available for Midway. But the Japanese think, well, we've sunk a U.S. carrier, another one's damaged, maybe not operable either. We have 4 fleet carriers, Kaga's repaired, we have experienced pilots. Midway's still looking like it's going to be an easy victory. So they're not sweating missing these two. I just wanted to point that out, why they're not there. Would they have changed the course of the battle? Maybe. They're Japan's most advanced carriers in 1942. But with that, let's talk about how, well, over the next few months, the battle, the war in the Pacific would turn. Now, Midway was not like, okay, by June 8, everything's great and America's winning. No, it was literally the turning point. And it would take time, months, even maybe a year, before you could say the U.S. was really getting the upper hand. But up until June, even though the Coral Sea wasn't a 100% victory, it wasn't exactly a loss either, the Japanese were having their way, especially against the British Navy, and of course against the U.S. battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor. So I'm not going to go too deep into Midway here, kind of like with Pearl Harbor. It's not the point of this video, but we'll give the Cliff Notes version. By May 27, 1942, the 4 operational fleet carriers were in formation and steaming towards Midway. They wanted to draw out the American carriers, the ones that were remaining, have a decisive victory, and basically rule the oceans. And they would operate in a similar fashion as before, with Kaga and Akagi working together, and Akagi being the flagship of the fleet. And they would be assigned targets on the East Island, and they would be loaded up with the 27 D3As, 27 B5Ns, and 20 A6Ms. So you had some zeros for fighters, dive bombers doing dive bomber things, obviously, to hit the carriers, and the B5Ns were originally loaded up with torpedoes for just in case, but they were ready to switch over to, conventional bombs if necessary. So they get going 8:30 that morning. Things go, and at first it is going the way of the Japanese, although it's kind of a stalemate. The TBD Devastators, as we know today, were less than ineffective. There were also some attempts by B-17s running through at least 9:30 that morning, several waves. Losses here, losses there, but if anything, the Japanese are maybe slightly winning the battle. But at around 10:20, a flight of 28 SBDs, dive bombers, basically sneak over, and they all see Kaga. Remember, she looks like a Kagi here with the refit, and they go for her. They're carrying 500 kg and 1,000 kg bombs, and they strike. They all go, and first Kaga gets hit by 3 of the 500s, and then the 4th, which she's already in really not good shape because not an armored deck, but then a 1,000-pounder gets a direct hit, not to mention some near misses and everything else. Whew, it's rough. She catches fire. Things are bad. Already by 11 something, they're having to get some other ships to come and take off crew, and she's going to go down or just outright explode. And I would say technically she was the first to really get a mortal blow, although it's hard to say. We can say, though, that she had the heaviest losses at about 811 crew lost, including 21 aviators, aircraft that were lost of hers. And her sister ship, well, didn't fare a whole lot better. I said that whole flight of SBDs targeted Kaga. That's true. But then they saw a Kagi, and a few peeled off, 3 or 4, and went for her. So very small, but why not? Unfortunately for her, 5-6 minutes later, one of them got a more or less really good hit with a 1,000-pounder, 1,000 kilo, I'm not sure which, whatever. Big bomb. And this set off some fires, some things, some floodings. In fact, the captain ordered the magazines to be flooded to keep them from exploding. She's not in a good way. Plus, she's losing several of her aircraft, too. And this is really the plane that's pretty famous for switching from torpedoes to bombs, back to torpedoes with the B-5Ns, and, kind of being caught with her pants down with all the planes on the deck, refueling, arming, rearming, disarming, because she's already been sending them out on sorties against Midway and the U.S. aircraft. And so it's just all a big explosion with that 1,000-pounder, 1,000-kiloer. But it's more of a slow burn, quite literally. But that said, by the afternoon, they know that she's going to go down. And in fact, after they take the crew off, they will fire torpedoes on her and essentially scuttle her that evening. But, thankfully her losses are light compared to Kaga, 267, I believe. Look, just because the Japanese were the aggressors, just because, America won the war, doesn't mean I have to rejoice in death. And I don't, because these are just young men who are fighting for their country, and they were told a lot of stuff via propaganda. Fortunate for America, unfortunate for Japan. We're only halfway through the trauma of Midway, and it's not even lunchtime yet. What about Soryu? Again, this model's from when she was first launched in 1938, but actually at Midway, she could argue to have the most advanced aircraft. She's fitted out with 18 Zeros and 18 B-5N Kates and 16 D-3A valves, and that's because she has 2 prototype D-4Ys, the next generation in reconnaissance and dive bomber, so 18 total, so the most advanced airplanes. And so she is kind of charged with scouting, and she's given the task with hitting the airfields on the eastern side of the island, kind of neutralizing resistance. She does take some losses, more than some of the other carriers early on, but she does weather the TBD Devastator hit around 9:20, 9:30 with no real damage and shooting all those down. The whole Devastator thing, it's admirable what those guys did. They literally bought time with their lives. But, well, her fate would turn around very soon after Kaga and Akagi's. By 10:25, 13 SBDs from Yorktown target her, and they're carrying the big bombs, the 1,000 ones, and she gets hit pretty much directly with 3. One front, one back, and kind of one middle down below. So it's literally a game of Battleship, and she's got 3 red markers on her. It's bad. So much so that within 15 minutes, the captain of a Japanese fleet aircraft carrier orders abandoned ship. So Japanese destroyers pull her alongside, get her crew off, and she's a flaming wreck. But she's still floating, so they do have to torpedo her. Finally, she sinks a little after 19:30 that day. But, I mean, she hasn't been habitable for hours. And while Kaga has the most loss that day, remember, Shoryu has a much smaller crew, 1,200. Of those, 711 die. So the ratio is even worse. She loses the majority of her crew because it was just so sudden and so effective, quite frankly. So she is glug, glug, glug. But her sister, Hiryu, Flying Dragon, she's going to make it. She's going to get out. At least that was the feeling early on. The Flying Dragon, its targets were on Sand Island, which that just doesn't sound attractive at all. Either way, she is going in and blowing shortly after 7 a.m. And at first, having really good luck. She actually goes up against half a dozen or so TBF Avengers, the first time we've seen those, stationed on Midway. They're essentially advanced prototypes or pre-production at this point. They don't really do much damage, and many are shot down, but they're doing better than the Devastators will later. And there are 2 waves of SBDs that try 8:30 that morning, and they're pretty ineffective too. The B-17 that tries to hit them, pretty ineffective. And no surprise that the TBD Devastators from the carriers, not from the island, don't have much better success an hour later. The only thing is, she has lost about a dozen aircraft, mostly fighters at this point. But other than that, holding up fine. Her complement is 18, 18, 18. So, like everyone else, she's got the D3As, she's got the B5Ns, armed with torpedoes, and they will switch out for bombs and back to torpedoes, the whole kind of rigmarole as the rest. And interestingly, whereas the other 3 carriers get hit hard around 10:30 by the big flight of SBDs, she doesn't. She actually does send up more Zeros to kind of reinforce the air patrol and try to coordinate things, and by 11 o'clock, she's the only functional carrier left, and so she launches a flight of 18 D3As, escorted by 6 Zeros, and they're targeting the U.S. carriers. Funnily enough, they actually cross paths with a flight of SBDs on the way. I think 1 or 2 of the Zeros are damaged in this, but it's pretty ineffective, and this flight of SBDs will be ineffective again. But, well, maybe the tide's turning, because those D3As, they find Yorktown a little after lunchtime, who had already been damaged at Coral Sea and had had a quick patch job done at Pearl Harbor. Well, the D3As, and they had a little hard time getting through, thanks to the Wildcats. Of the 18, only 7 got through, and of those, 2 were shot down while they were making their attack run. And of the Zeros, there's only 2 or 3 left in the sky. So their flight group, their aircraft, it's taking a hit. But those 5 or 6 that did get off their bombs, you get 3 direct hits on Yorktown and 2 near misses that caused some damage too. So by 1:30, Yorktown is on fire. The Japanese think, well, she's gone under, and that's that. So the planes return, although greatly diminished, and they'll send them back out. Now at this point, she's the only carrier, and some of the aircraft from Akagi and Kaga are now reinforcing Hiryu's flight, which is good because she's running out of planes really fast. So they send out the B-5Ns, armed with torpedoes again. And they're told explicitly, don't go for Yorktown. She's done for, which is probably true. Thing is, the U.S. have a lot better damage control than the Japanese, so by 2:30, the fires are out, things are contained, and actually she's making speed at nearly 20 knots. So they think, oh, that's a different carrier. And so the B-5Ns attack her. And they do get 2 torpedo hits on her. And, Yorktown put up a fight. She was even able to get about 15, 16 Wildcats in the air, and they fight. They shoot down some of the B-5Ns. The torpedo bombers like that are almost sitting ducks. And their protection from Zeros is pretty thin as well. Nevertheless, Yorktown it can't take it. So the order to abandon ship is given, and, well, now the Japanese do have a victory. So 1 U.S. carrier down, 3 Japanese. So by 1630, so 4:30 in the afternoon, the admiral on board, kind of consolidating his air group, says, hey, we're going to make another attack run at maybe Enterprise, maybe Hornet, and try to catch them off guard around dusk. Only thing is, of those B-5Ns, only a handful make it back, 5 or 6 of those in Zeros. So they are hurting, but they're going to launch what they've got. That's the plan. But the U.S., well, they've got another plan. And at first it doesn't work. Another flight of SBDs go shortly before 1700, 5 p.m., and are pretty much ineffective, missing or just, anything. But then Hiryu maneuvers to pick up some float planes and pretty much stumbles right into the path of some bombs. And now she's taken damage. A lot of damage. She gets hit 3-4 times, all in the front. All just kind of one concentrated spot. Soryu kind of got hit throughout, like a game of Battleship. This one just got clobbered all in one place, essentially breaking the front of the ship off, throwing parts back, destroying the bridge. It was a mess. An absolute mess. And, well, now the final IJN fleet carrier is toast. Rather literally. But she's stubborn. She's still got some fight in her, which is hard to believe. Hiryu continues to have a bit of strange charm. A little before 6 p.m., a flight of B-17s try to have a go at her and finish her off, but pretty ineffective. Nevertheless, 4,000 pounders hitting, yeah, you'd think she'd go under, but they're fighting it. Finally, though, a little before 21:30 that night, they stopped the engines, which should have been it. I mean, they should have let the water come in. You're giving up the fight. Nope, still going. Shortly before midnight, there's a big explosion. Something finally cooked off. Is that it? Nope, still going. I mean, she's not an effective fighting force. Even before all this, she had fewer than a dozen bombers left on board, and only just over that for fighters. Still, it was a little after 3 a.m. that the order to abandon ship was finally given. So for the next 2 hours, they were offloading crew. And then a little after 5, they torpedo her. That should do it, right? Nope. By 7 a.m., still floating. And there's still some crew are staying on board, like the command staff. Some are still trying to fight. I mean, it's a lost cause, but they're evacuating some. Finally, a little after 9 a.m., finally, she slips under the waves. That's a tough carrier, especially considering she wasn't armored. Because they had time to offload her crew, she lost 389 during the battle and right after, and then a few more would be lost in the ocean. But at least she would survive to the next day. That's more than the other ones. And at least, for the Japanese, she did take another with her, Yorktown. She had the victory. The only thing is her flight group took heavy losses from the get-go. But it's also interesting to me that she's the only one that really had any luck against the SBDs. And that was Midway. It was decisive. In fact, the battle went exactly the way the Japanese had hoped. It's just the sides were reversed. They hoped to, destroy the 3 U.S. carriers. Instead, they lost their 4 primary carriers. But maybe if they had been there, it had been different. But without Shokoku and Suikoku, they didn't have those. Who knows? That does mean, though, they still have 2 fleet carriers, and repairs are almost done on 1. They also have some escort and light carriers. In the U.S., they're down to 2 fleet carriers themselves. This is long before the Essex come on board. So really, even though we think of Midway as the turning point, it simply evened the playing field. America still doesn't have a clear advantage, at least not from Allied perspective, by June 6, June 7 of 1942. In the summer of 1942, Taiho is still a year off from even being complete and a year and a half from being commissioned. However, Junyo and Ryu were sent up to the Aleutians, Dutch Harbor, to hit Alaska. Hosho, which, she's limited, but she's still there, is in the waters too. And there's a couple other carriers that we'll talk about in part 3. So that on top of the 2 remaining major fleet carriers, Japan still has a bite, not to mention other warships. They would actually attack targets up in Alaska beginning on July 3rd, running through the 6th or 7th, and then go back home on the 13th. Maybe it was a Friday. And while these weren't the most effective and detrimental things, they were reasonably successful, all things considered. And so Ryujo and Junyo, along with Junyo's sister ship Hiyo, would be used for the Battle of Guadalcanal, Eastern Solomons, in August of that year. Now, I should just say that Hosho would be sent home and commissioned as a training carrier late that year and help with takeoff landings, operations, bombing practice in the 1943. So we can put her aside for a little while, but she will become important again. But Ryujo and Junyo and Hiyo would be very important in August, hitting targets. They're loaded up. Keep in mind that Ryujo is not tiny. She's still able to put 35 planes in the air. But while she had some success early on, her number would come up on August 24, 1942, when planes from the USS Saratoga would find her, hitting her 3 or 4 times, setting her ablaze. And keep in mind, she's already kind of an unstable vessel. Yeah, she's not long for this world, and she too will be lost. Luckily for the Japanese, I suppose, she has a smaller crew, so only around 120, 130 crew and aviators are lost with her. But it does send a carrier to the bottom of the sea, maybe a little bigger, more effective than a light carrier, but definitely not a fleet carrier. Nevertheless, Junyo's there, and well, will remain important along with the others. So August, as we roll into September, things are slowly but surely turning in favor of the Allies, but it's an agonizing fight, and the Japanese still have enough assets in theater to turn it around, most decidedly. So in hindsight, we can look back and go, well, the Japanese, they're starting to lose. But then, no. Just because their winning streak was broken doesn't mean they couldn't keep on winning. And again, they had other carriers and new aircraft like the D4Y in the works. So as we dawn a new year, it's anyone's war. So in part 3, we'll talk about 1943, 1944, later on battles, and look at a few more interesting and unique aircraft carrying vessels in the ocean, and then of course talk about the fates of Shokaku and Tsukako from Pearl Harbor. In fact, these are the two remaining fleet carriers from that, at least from the Japanese perspective, glorious attack. But I think that's enough for now. What do you think? Hope you enjoyed it. Again, I'm just having fun. This is all off memory, you can tell, and I'm trying to kind of truncate things because we could go on forever. And this is not something I'm an expert in. I was not a World War II Pacific War history teacher when I was a teacher. I did other things, but you know, we can enjoy it. And if you like this stuff, check out more in-depth channels and histories. And if you'd like to hear more about the firearms that the Japanese use, now that I can help you with over on the main Mishaco channel. Done tons of videos on Arisakas, Nambus, and many other things. With that, hope everyone's having a good week. This is Misha. Catch you very soon to wrap up this war next time.